I'm Robert Micosio. Welcome to tonight's show on how to develop your character for your book. And welcome to a writer's conspiracy project, which is basically writers giving writers advice on how they develop their characters, how they develop their plots. So if you're an aspiring writer, have a seat and we'll see if we can inspire you to sit down and do a little bit of writing tonight. Last week we covered the subject of the importance of being able to do research. Research is an important thing because a lot of times, even if you're just researching for the pure need to just read, just gathering information. If you're a writer, you should be very into gathering information because you never know when it's going to wind up being part of a plot of a book. Characters, as far as I'm concerned, when I do my writing, the first thing that I do is I determine exactly what I'm writing about, if it's an adventure, or if it's a drama, if it's action, or just something comical, just something satire. And then you develop the character by the development of the character basically comes down to this. How you're going to work the character into the story and into the plot so that the character is compliant with the plot of the story, and the plot of the story and the character are kind of intermingling with each other as it goes along. Because take, for instance, a Terminator. Okay, you have Sarah Connors was somebody who was totally inexperienced, very naive, had absolutely no desire of being military or anything like that. She was a waitress, and she was probably an aspiring actor too, because every waitress I ever known was always an aspiring actress or actor. But anyway, so you can see how somebody can be totally irrelevant to what the plot of the story is in the beginning, and then as the story progresses, that character will work their way into the story plot or the storyline. When you have more than one character that you have to focus on, as a writer, you have to be able to get into the minds of the characters, because you have to keep them consistent throughout the story. If somebody is nervous and very shy, and they have to remain that throughout the whole story, but of course, there may come a time in the story where that person actually has to stand up and has to do something. Whatever your storyline is, they might have to stand up to somebody who has been bullying them around. They might also have to stand up to a parent, or they might have to stand up to their boss. Whatever the character's nature is, you have to keep in mind that they have to respond to the situations according to what their nature of that character is. So you can't have somebody standing up and being all macho if the person is a wimp by nature, or the other way around. So developing a character will definitely be a challenge to you, because if you have one character and another character, they have to intermingle with each other, and conflict is what moves the story along. So you might have two people who do not get along together, and they are always in some type of a petty little quarrel with each other. And then somewheres along in your book's plot, it comes to a point where they have to stand together and they get over their petty little differences. Sometimes two people who are aligned with each other are basically the kind of person who they get along with each other, knowing each other all their life, and then all of a sudden there's that one thing that they did, and that friendship is kind of, now it's on the razor's edge, and there's this mistrust between themselves. It's one of those, you got to kind of go with the flow of the storyline, and when the storyline, it might get to a certain place to where your character is actually taking on a transformation of some type. And once your story starts to take off and the character starts to build chapter by chapter by chapter, you need to go back through the book and go back to chapter 1, which is what I do. I might get to maybe chapter 7 or chapter 8, and then I'll go back to chapter 1 and I'll read it. And what I'm reading it for is to make sure that I'm not repeating myself, and also that the character is staying true to form. And as new characters are being introduced, I'm watching, making sure that those characters are now not competing with the main character for the plot of the story. You have your primary characters, you have secondary characters, and then you have people who just kind of insert themselves somewhere along the line that keep the story moving. Because as soon as your story falls dead on its face, the reader goes, and takes the book and puts it down. So you don't want to lose the interest of your reader, because that's the reason why you're writing. You're writing to entertain the person who purchased your book, and the person you want to keep them entertained, because if you keep them entertained all the way to the very end, when you publish your next book, they want to buy that too. So basically, you're like an actor, except you're not acting. You're writing a play in your mind that is being translated onto paper, and you have to make it clear enough so that when the other person is reading it, he understands what you're saying. I had a lot of problems when I was doing research with the Revolutionary War, mostly because a lot of researchers were writing from research that they researched, and some were writing it from the British perspective, and some were writing it from the American perspective, and you had to know which was the right flank and which was the left flank, and basically you had to understand that when you were on the opposite side of the battlefield, you were also referring to the right side was the enemy's left side. So you have to be aware of your perspective and making sure that the reader understands which character you're talking about. That's the reason why it's important to develop the certain characteristics for certain characters. Things they might say, little lines they might do, certain ways they would act. I had one character in a book on Balatar, anytime that she got frustrated, she went shopping. It it was sort of a stereotype, but it worked, and it kind of makes you laugh because it's no matter what predicament this character got into, the first thing that they thought about was go shopping. Um, but there were other characters that I developed, like in the Battle of the Minutemen. You had two friends that grew up together. One was married to the other one's sister. They went off to the Battle of Concord because it was an adventure to them. They really didn't expect nothing to happen because they were coming from a town that was outside of the locale of Boston. They were an hour away. So by the time they got to Lexington was already done. So they found themselves in Concord. And a lot of it was waiting around, waiting for the generals to make a decision or the officers to make a decision. And they weren't making decisions because they didn't hear whether or not there was a war declared, because they were waiting for John Hancock to proclamate a declaration of war because he was the president of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts at that time. So these characters, as they develop, begin as innocent farm boys that get involved with different degrees of military exercise. One becomes a writer for the Express, and the other one he's just a frontline soldier. So you get two perspectives. You have the one that is carrying messages back and forth to the Second Continental Congress and going and to various battlefields, and you get his perspective of what it was like at that time during the Revolutionary War, and you get the other one's perspective as far as being at the battlements, on the field, and it gives a wider range of the perception on what it would be like if you were a soldier during the Revolutionary War. Another book, Balatar, took place roughly about 2,000 years ago, around 1500 BC is basically when the book took place. So it's not a whole lot of people, and it's really primitive, and the characters are very simplified. And as the story develops, you learn that they develop out of innocence, and as the story continues to go, they become more interfaced with reality than they anticipated, and other actors or other subjects come into the picture, and each chapter explains a different character and a different perspective. And by the time you get to chapter 5, the plot of all of the characters of the book are laid out before the reader. There will be some other characters that do not have the significance of the others, and then there will be some that'll turn up somewhere along the line that not until the end of the book will they really have any significance, because they would be the ones that would be tying the entire story together. a lot of writers that I've met is they their characters are written in a way that it's their own. Um, they have them for uh, I can't really think of the word, but anyway, so so developing a character is basically not a really complicated process. The story, you just got to keep track of exactly what the how the character is building over the course of your chapters, and so the next thing you have to to develop around your characters is the plot of the book. When you have the plot of the book in front of you, sometimes when you're writing, there really isn't a plot. It more or less it develops as you go along. A book that I had just finished writing was it started off as pure adventure, and it just got twisted into a couple of scientific experiments. But as the characters developed in it, you started to realize that um, there was new experiences because of the things that they had to go through. Um, the plots of the book, they develop. Either you have an idea of what you want and you try to make it work, and sometimes you have to go back and rewrite it. But I'll always force myself to write at least the first 5 chapters, and then I would go back and I would go through it and I would say, well, this works and that works. And most of the time it's just a matter of organizing the facts. And as you organize the facts and you make them compliant with the character, your book begins to develop, and 9 times out of 10, the book will take on its own image. You're just sitting there pecking the keys, but the story's writing itself. Um, Sometimes if I run into a situation where I'll only write a paragraph at a time. I'll write a paragraph and I'll, close the book and go do whatever I have to do. Go do some errands, watch some TV, read a magazine, do some research, work on an article or something, and I'll go back to it maybe an hour. Sometimes I'll sit there for 3 or 4 days before I go back to it. But when I go back to it, I'll force myself to write at least another paragraph. And eventually, I'll write enough paragraphs to be able to go back to where I found myself in a situation where I ran out of dialogue or ran out of description of some type and just kind of hit a roadblock, and I'll go through those paragraphs and I'll start editing. I'll start, cutting off the rough edges off of the characters. Start put things into perspective. Always check, select the best word. Do a lot of spelling, and then eventually I'll finish off that chapter and I'll get an idea that'll take it, and sometimes it'll put a little bit of a twist on the story and it'll take it further. But you're not trying to put so many twists in your book that the reader's brain is tied in a knot. You're trying to keep it simple. So the changes in your character or the changes in your storyline are like the changes in music. They if you listen to something and it might have a certain rhythm to it, and then all of a sudden it gets to a certain point and it changes its rhythm. Well, book is pretty much the same way. You get into a rhythm of words, and your character is in a rhythm of circumstances and situations, and then you get to the main event. And I always have a main event for each chapter. Each chapter has got its own little climax in it, and that climax leads to the next chapter, and that chapter starts off from that climax and kind of leads the reader along, and then it gets to a certain point again to where it starts to build into another climax, and the climax might be every 3 or 4 chapters. I write in a best way to describe is I write in a loop. I start off with a story, I lead it up to its climax, and then I follow it down. And when I reach that one point to where it leads you back to the beginning of that cycle of the story, and that's where you find out the information, and that leads you on to the next great adventure for the next cycle. So each one of my chapters, or each number of chapters, kind of follows itself in a loop, so that it leads you along and then leads you back, and then you understand exactly what your reader understands what you're trying to convey to them in the story. And that's what makes it entertaining, is when the reader is going along going, okay, all right, well, that's interesting, and all of a sudden you get them back, and you throw that one piece of information at him that he was missing, and he goes, oh man, that was a great chapter, and then he wants to read the next one. And so basically you're writing each chapter, trying to get the reader to read the next chapter after that, and it's a cycle as you go along. And I developed that style over years. My books are not one-dimensional. My books are, you can have 3 or 4 layers on these books. And when you get to, with Balatar, when you get to its 5th book, which is the final book in its series, and only the first 2 have been released, the other 3 haven't been released yet. They're still in the editing process. When you get to that last book, and you look at the way that story developed, each chapter rolled into the next, and each book rolled into the next, until you got to the last book, and it rolled right back into the beginning of the story prior to the setting of Balatar. And that right there just lays out everything in front of you. Those little mysteries that were left in the first book, those little mysteries that were never answered in the 5 chapters, in the 5 chapter books, finally turns around, and it's all revealed in that last book. I'm on the 3rd book in the Battle of the Minutemen, which is the series is called the Invasion of America series. In that series there, each of the chapters is another battle. Sometimes if it's a really, really good story, a really good battle, like the Battle of Bunkers Hill, or let me think, because you had some really good ones, Lexington and Concord, and Ticonderoga. That right there, you had some interesting character with the Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen and their dispute. A lot of people you don't hear about the fact that Benedict Arnold actually had orders from the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, and they were secret orders, to go to Ticonderoga and to confiscate all of the weapons and all of the ordnance and the cannons and bring them back over to Boston, where there was live battle. Well, a lot of people think that Benedict Arnold was conceited, but he had this order, and he understood that his success might have an influence on the success of the outcome of the siege of Boston. So he didn't want to fail. Call it ego. I know I would have been pretty much the same way. If somebody gives me a job, I'm going to get it done. So you can call that whatever you want, conceit or whatever you want, but I'm not going to fail, because to me that would be a disgrace to myself. So he was trying to take command, because he felt that if he didn't have command of the operation to go over to Ticonderoga, that he would lose the opportunity, he would lose the ability to be able to take those weapons and bring them back to Boston. He took on a lot of initiative. He sailed up the river, and he took Fort St. Jean. He confiscated 3 or 4 ships. One of them he named the Enterprise. He basically set up a defense on the river, so that the British had to delay their excursion down the river to attempt to take back Ticonderoga and to be able to set up a defense there. If they had accomplished that in the time frame that the British had set, the entire outcome of the war might have been different. But the things that Benedict Arnold had done, in spite of all of the negative reaction that he had between the Connecticut Congress and between the Second Continental Congress, he actually made more contribution than most other generals during the Revolutionary War. It was sad that it turned out the way that it did, but if you read his all of the circumstances around Benedict Arnold, you would say, it might have been a stupid on the fact that he had became a traitor and had sold information. He was selling out West Point. If West Point would have been taken over by the British, they would have had control over that entire area. So when you're developing a character, you're developing a character that is a historical character, where you actually have their character is already written about. You already know that this general was a hothead, and this general here, it wasn't necessarily the best general in the world, but he got his job done when the opportunity came. characters they have to be multi-layered. They can't just be very, matter of fact. The best way to study about character development is to watch the people around you. Talk to the friends that you have, and you'll pick up certain little quirks about them and stuff. It doesn't mean that you have to write about it, but you can understand that some people have a really great sense of humor, and other people have the personality of I don't know, I guess a hand grenade. But it's all relevant. I saw a movie the other night. The person who was the second in command, a general, actually he was a sergeant. This guy had anger issues. This guy was all over the place. All you had to do was look at him wrong, and he was in your face. The general kept him by his side because he didn't have to raise his voice because the sergeant was there to do that. And he kept him there because he knew that he was just going to blow out all over everybody, and he had them scared. To where the general said, well, Sarge, let me handle this. And he'd go in there and he'd talk to them. And these guys were more willing to listen to the general than they was to listen to the sergeant. They didn't want the sergeant. They wanted to avoid him as much as possible. And that was the whole use that the general had of this sergeant. So there's a lot of coordinating that you have, because even the characters themselves, they know how to manipulate the other guy, and they know how to make him respond. They know what his triggers are and what and some of the things that they can get away with them. It's like when you're having a friend, you know how far you can push them. That's what makes you a friend, because if you push him too far, you know he's going to turn on you and he's going to say something to you. So you don't push him that far. You know right where to stop. And that's exactly the same thing when you're writing a book. You know exactly how to convey your character to the reader, because that's the most important person, is the person who is reading your book. You're not writing for a specific reader. You are writing for a specific mind frame. A person who is into adventure doesn't want to read a drama. And a person who wants to read a drama, he might be all right with a little bit of adventure in there, but he wants a story and a plot. So when you have your book and somebody comes back to you and says, I really didn't like it, you just got to kind of say, well, all right, it just wasn't right for that person. But there's still 307 million people in the United States of America, and you only have to sell 100,000 copies, and you can live comfortably off of that. So your percentages of reaching an audience all depends upon how you promote your book. There's a lot of expensive ways to promote your book, and then there's a lot of less expensive ways of promoting your book. We put out our marcocommunications.com on there. You're able to get a spot for your book, and what it would do is cost $45 for a whole year, and the only purpose that it serves is that when somebody is reading our magazine and they're interested in your book, they push that picture, and it goes right to your website. So we don't have any control over your writing or anything. We don't sell your writing. we just make your writing a little bit more accessible. It's the same thing if you wanted to write a book and donate it as a free book to read, or if you wanted to sell your ebooks. Everything is connected to our online magazine. We have articles on the online magazine that vary on to different things. It's mostly historical fact. We have a sponsor called the No Affiliation Alliance, which is for election reform here in the state of Pennsylvania. But the entire project here is about having writers come on the show. And we had 2 people that are scheduled, but not for the next week or so. One had an operation on their arm, and the other one was out of town for the holidays. So once they come in, we start to do, we'll see what they have to say about character development and plots and research. Because sitting here talking, and trying to explain exactly how I write. I wish I had some of my books here, but we're waiting for them to come in the mail. And we had handed out a few of them, and now we're waiting for some responses. So the next great thing is the getting on to shows such as with my friend Tony Rollo. Tony Rollo is a director in Tennessee, and we're coordinating with him, getting with what a website that he's now putting up, which is to post jobs. If you are a writer and you're looking for a job, this website is one where you would go through and you would browse through it and you would submit your portfolio, and you would get contacted by the people who were out to hire you. It would be the same thing with directors and actors and producers. Our magazine, my magazine, is taken off on a different spur. It's more towards you published a book, or you have an acting group or a theater and you want to promote it. That's the place to do it, or you can come here on the show. Once we get somebody trained to do the technical part of this, we'll be able to take phone calls and we'll start talking to people who might have questions. Right now, we don't have that ability because, well, as much as everybody wants to do it, unfortunately, they don't, whatever reason. So, let's see, what time is it? So, we have, let's see, how much time we got left?
21 minutes.
Oh, 21 minutes. Thank you, sir. So, 21 minutes, let's see. We got which book we want to talk about. We got the Time Benders. Time Benders is the second book on the Balatar, and that takes you from the ancient times of Balatar to the modern times of Balatar, and you start to see some of the things that you might see on some of these National Geographic shows, and we kind of build a plot on things like DMT and things like the CIA, and develop these things into our story to make it interesting. With the second book on the series of the Invasion of America series, you have the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. Now, the Battle of Brooklyn Heights was a pretty interesting book because a lot of the it was a much larger scale. In fact, it probably was the largest battle that they had in the entire Revolutionary War. The strategy was to keep the British from getting this major port. But once George Washington got into the battle, he realized it was a lost cause from the beginning. And by sending his troops over to Brooklyn Heights, he realized that he had placed himself in a strategic trap. He trapped himself. And had he not managed to sneak out of Brooklyn Heights under the fog with rowboats and take his army back over to the main island, it would have been all over right there in Brooklyn Heights. So his escape from being captured and being was actually one of many of his narrow escapes. It was he was a sly fox, and he got that reputation from the British as being the old fox, because he was hard to catch, and he maneuvered, and all of the Second Continental Congress was yelling for George Washington to attack directly. But George Washington knew he could never win a direct battle with the British because he was outnumbered. They had all of the supplies they could ever want. They had all the reserves they could ever want. At the point where they had crossed the river from Brooklyn to Manhattan, when the British crossed that point in the river, the American troops that were there had spikes and spears. They had sickles. They didn't even have muskets. They had nothing. They had 3 cannons. So when the British start coming across at that location, the Americans just looked at it and said, heck with this, and they left. George Washington, unaware that these guys only had, spears and swords, is trying to rally them, and he gets frustrated and he throws his hat down and he goes, how am I going to win this war with people who have no discipline? Well, if you ask me, if you got 1,000 troops coming across the water and they're all armed and they're setting a barrage on you with all these ships, and the only thing you have is a fly swatter, he who turns and runs away lives to fight some other day, and I'm sorry, heroes just aren't worth anything if they're dead. If you have to give your life up for your country, that's what you do. You stand your ground. But if you're in a situation where the only thing you're going to be is carnage, you have all the right to run, as far as I'm concerned. So you kind of have to develop that into your character. Because the character was there, and you have to convey this, that, hey, I'm sorry, but I'm not staying here and getting killed if it serves no other purpose than to be killed. So they ran. And when they got to the second defenses, the colonels and the generals at the second defense had stopped them and turned them around so that they would stand there and they would fight. But at least there they had a chance, because there was enough ammunition and enough weapons to hold off the British Army, which they did for 2 or 3 days. And so you got to take these things into consideration when you're writing for characters. You hear all these things about George Washington, but he had a pretty good temper. When it came out, you didn't want to be in front of him. It was the same thing with a lot of different generals. They were soft spoken, but when it came time for them to be the general, you knew they were the general. And that's pretty much how you have to write the character. There was a lot of perspective that was given. You use a little bit of your writer's license to develop some of these historical characters, because there is a history. There are people who listed them and they have done a character check on them, and you can tell that they were drinkers, or they were fighters, and they liked they liked women. General Lee loved women. In fact, he was captured, at some hotel, and he was captured by the British, and he was caught in his underwear. That just basically gives you a personality perception on how to write the character for that character for General Lee. It's the same thing with General Benedict Arnold. He was a hothead. He was vain. He was arrogant, but he knew his military strategy, and people just didn't take him seriously. And because he knew what he was talking about and knew what he was doing, and people weren't taking him seriously, that's the reason why he was acting like a fool. It's the same thing with the characters Malachi and he's basically was a soft-spoken person, and he went through a lot of life and death experiences on the battlefield, and you can slowly start to see how these life and death situations had changed him. He no longer was the farm boy that he was introduced as in the beginning of the book. He became a hardened soldier. He escaped a lot of life and death situations, and eventually you start to understand why he's doing some of the things that he's doing, because they didn't call it post-traumatic stress back then. They just called it something, bad temperament. But even his wife had begun to notice the changes in him, and he sort of lost his feelings about things because he became numb, because he's seen so many, horrific sights. You also have some other things that happened with his friend John, and John had a different perspective. He more or less got into more of the spying part of the war, so he saw things from a different perspective. But even he got into situations to where he found a lot of things that were kind of a little bit out of place, a little bit strange. started finding out that there were groups in the country that wanted the war for their, to expand their own ideals, and you have to pretty much get inside of the character's mind and just convey it in words so that other people can understand it. It's not an easy thing to do, but after you've done it for a while, you start to keep track of these things, and that's another thing you need to do. You need to write when you have more than one character and you have special things. Write yourself an index on these, so that when you're not sure about the spelling of a name, you can just go back and you can pull up this list. I have it sitting right next to the book. I just tap it and I'll open it up and I'll go and I'll check the name of the person and make sure I have it spelt right, because the last thing you want to do is have to go through the whole book and have to start checking your spelling on each and every township or each and every person, and whether or not this person was a colonel or this person was a general. You're saving yourself a lot of work, and it does help a lot in keeping your book organized. Each chapter leads to the next until you get to the end. And if it's the final book, then you decide how to end it. You can either leave it as a cliffhanger and let the reader develop his own conclusions, or you can leave it as a something very profound or something. It depends on how it ends. I mean, some of my books, they end with something really, really bizarre or off the wall. I like to come up with endings that, instead of just the end, or some people like to go, or this is just the beginning, or some other little catchy little ending. I like to really make it an impact, a statement, and so let's see. So if you are writing a book and you're starting one, after you decide what you're going to write about, you design your characters to coincide with your plot. And as you're writing, you just go back. If I start to lose track of my plot, I always stop and I go back to the first chapter and I'll read it from the beginning all the ways to where I left off. And sometimes there's a couple of paragraphs in those first chapters that gives you the direction to where you want to go from there, because you have a lot of information that is being put out. And when you put out that information, you get to a certain point, you can't remember everything that you wrote. So backtracking and following up sometimes gives you the ability to start tying ends off. A perfect example would be the Clint Eastwood movies. If you watch them, it starts off with something really bizarre, something that means absolutely nothing. And as it goes along, you start finding yourself in situations that really have no connection to it. And you start meeting characters who they don't mean anything to anyone else, until you get to maybe I'd say about 2/3 of the way into the book, or into the movie, or whatever you're doing, you get to the point to where things start to connect. You get to the point to where things are starting to connect. The person who, in the very beginning, was shot was somebody who was a bandit, but he was related to somebody who was somebody's brother, and that brother is the one that is now the focal point, and he wants to find the bounty hunter who shot him or whatever. But if you watch their movies and you watch it, it flows into a sort of like a circle, to where you get to a certain point, and each one of the details that had absolutely no meaning in the beginning starts to tie itself off. So when you get to the end, when you get to the end, all of the loose ends have been tied up, and your reader or your viewer is actually happy. They were satisfied with the movie because it was entertaining. Didn't mean nothing. Didn't say anything politically. It just basically was entertaining. It started, you watched it, it was interesting, and when it finished, it was still interesting. That's the way a book should be. It shouldn't all of a sudden get to a certain point and then it dies. And if it does, you're just going to lose the reader, and he's going to put the book down and not going to say anything good about it. You got to keep the beginning of the book pretty interesting, because if you can't get them to get through the first 3 or 4 chapters, it's, you didn't succeed as a writer. You didn't entertain. And 9 times out of 10, it's a bad character development. The character fell short. He wasn't interesting enough. He didn't carry the plot. He didn't meet the storyline. So we're about to call it a night, and we hope some of you aspiring writers out there maybe picked up something here or there. It's kind of hard going ad lib here, right off the top of my brain. But if you're a writer, you shouldn't have to have it written down in front of you what you do. It's becomes second nature to you. And my friend Andy Edmonds didn't come today. He must have a family event, which is the reason why we ran a little bit longer than we anticipated. It's supposed to be a half-an-hour show. We took an hour, and I think it's a lot more interesting when it's only a half an hour, because I don't run out of things to say. But we'll go ahead and be looking forward to seeing you on our website. We're on Facebook. And we're also on the marcocommunications.com. We're also here every Thursday starting at 7 o'clock. If the other show is not going to be here, we're only going to do a half an hour. No point in trying to make something stretch. And we got our 1-minute countdown here, so we'll say goodnight, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place, and hope to hear from you. Send us an email at rmacosio@hotmail.com, or come on to our Facebook webpage and drop us a note. Let us know what you thought of the show. Only if it's good, though. We don't want bad criticisms. Okay, we may not be able to take that. Anyway, but if you want to be on our show, just go ahead and give us a call and we will get you on our show. All right? You don't have to be Stephen King. Good night. Bye.
Thank you. I did adjust the camera a little bit.
Okay.
When we first did it, you were sitting up nice and straight, and then you got relaxed and slouched
Yeah.
back a little bit.
Yeah.
So it wasn't hard to do,
Yeah,
especially with the setting I have here.
Yeah, I got into my I'm a cool writer.
Very good. Very good.
Right. So what did you
Also,
think? What did you think?
interesting. Actually, when I first saw Cliff setting you up here, I spotted one word, and I said to myself, I'm going to make myself scarce. And it was conspiracy. I saw that, and I thought you were going to be some sort of a conspiracy theorist and everything, and it's like, no. I'm going to stay away from that.
Yeah.
But, okay, the other thing I had to ask, did you misspell a word on purpose?
Which one?
Sponsored. You left the E out.
Oh, no, that said subscribe.
No. Go back to the next one.
Oh, okay.
The first word down here.
You're hallucinating. That's a
No, oh, you got three here. Yes, I would be hallucinating, wouldn't I? S-P-O-N-S-O-R-D.
Okay, we got it.
That's not hard. Go here and, there.
That's why we got editors.
E, and there you go, done.
Okay, that's what I had one guy got back to me, and the guy was an editor, was a publisher for the Evening Sun, and me and him got into a little squabble on Facebook one day, and what word was it? I can't think of what word it was. It was one of those words where if it had a letter, this, and it meant something else. Well, anyway, so one of
Single letter changed what it was really talking about, yeah.
So then a third person jumped there in because we were having this intellectual argument, and he came in. He says, "Do either one of you know the difference between?" I can't remember the word, and it was like, because neither one of you, both of you is spelling it wrong, and I went back to him. I says, that's the reason why we have editors.
Yeah.
You know.
That's the reason why I have word processor. I put it in the word processor and say, spell check.
Yeah, but it always spells my words wrong.
Oh,
I'll get it right, and it'll change it to something else. It does that to me on clients, and some weird words and stuff.
Okay.
It'll.
Oh, a quick question. You're not recording these?
I didn't record that one.
Okay.
We usually have something or put it in there and record it, but I wasn't.
Well, you mean here you have something like a hard drive you plug in?
Well, it goes up to Facebook.
Oh,
And
yeah.
It's recorded there.
It's recorded there? Okay. So
I hope it.
I know nothing about that because we don't do that. So
Yeah, I didn't think about
we
that.
always record it. I always record a DVD in here, and I have a hard drive that I plug in right here.
Yeah.
That's my notes on there.
Okay.
I'm trying to write a sort of a user's manual. It's taken
So
me
you
10
can
years
record
to
it
get that far.
You can record it on a hard drive.
Yeah, I actually keep a hard drive here
Uh-huh.
that I record onto a hard drive, and then another gentleman takes that and fiddles around with it a little bit, puts it on YouTube. Plus, I always record it on DVD. Mostly just for my use, and if we have a guest speaker or something, I always give them a copy of the DVD, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I just didn't know. I don't know how Facebook works, so if it's recorded, then you've got a recording of it. Okay,